What happens when your largest energy supplier decides you're no longer their preferred customer? You watch helplessly as tankers carrying gas that used to heat American homes sail toward Asia instead. On January 10th, 2026, the LNG carrier GasLog Glasgow departed Kitimat Terminal in British Columbia, loaded with Canadian liquefied natural gas. Everyone expected this first major shipment would be symbolic, a ceremonial acknowledgement of new export capacity, with most supply still flowing south by pipeline to American utilities. Instead, it marked the beginning of Canada's systematic withdrawal from U.S. energy dependence. 3 days later, Trump's Energy Department quietly contacted Canadian natural resources officials requesting increased pipeline deliveries to offset rising American prices. The request wasn't public, it wasn't framed as negotiation, it was desperation disguised as routine coordination between allied governments, and Mark Carney's response came not through diplomatic channels, but through a press conference in Ottawa announcing $116 billion in energy infrastructure explicitly designed to serve Asian markets while American buyers compete for whatever volumes remain. Tonight, we're showing you how Canada's LNG export surge is physically cutting American utilities out of supply chains they built business models around, how Trump's requests for energy relief arrived after infrastructure decisions already locked Canadian gas into 20-year Asian contracts, and how the energy relationship that powered American industrial dominance for 70 years just became transactional rather than guaranteed. Here's what matters. Canadian natural gas to the United States isn't declining because of production problems. It's declining because Canada built infrastructure that makes American buyers optional. Canada produces approximately 17 billion cubic feet of natural gas daily. Historically, over half that volume flowed south through an integrated pipeline network connecting Western Canadian fields to American industrial facilities, power plants, and residential heating systems, Detroit automotive plants, Chicago chemical facilities, Boston power generators, all dependent on steady Canadian supply at prices lower than global LNG markets. The arrangement functioned on mutual benefit. Canadian producers gained guaranteed demand without expensive export infrastructure. American buyers secured reliable supply without geopolitical risk. No hostile governments, no shipping disruptions, just pipelines moving molecules across a border both countries treated as administrative formality rather than strategic barrier. Energy planners in Washington treated Canadian supply as effectively domestic. Import terminals received minimal investment because pipeline capacity from Canada eliminated need for overseas LNG. Industrial site selection prioritized proximity to Canadian pipeline interconnections. Utility long-term planning assumed Canadian volumes would grow alongside American demand. That planning framework just collapsed. Canadian natural gas exports to the United States averaged 9 billion cubic feet daily in January 2025. By December 2025, that volume fell to 5.4 billion cubic feet, a 40% reduction in 11 months. This wasn't gradual market adjustment responding to price signals. This was deliberate supply redirection enabled by newly operational export infrastructure. LNG Canada's Kitimat facility represents the physical manifestation of this strategic pivot. Phase 1 capacity, 14 million tons annually, equivalent to approximately 1.9 billion cubic feet per day. That's gas that 3 years ago would have automatically flowed to Seattle utilities and California power plants now being liquefied, loaded onto specialized tankers, and shipped to Japan, South Korea, and China under contracts signed in 2023-2024. The terminal's first commercial cargo departed January 10th, bound for South Korea's KOGAS under a 20-year supply agreement, not a spot cargo sold to highest bidder, a contractual commitment locking that supply away from American buyers for 2 decades. 5 more cargoes departed by month end, all destined for Asian utilities that signed long-term contracts, while American energy planners assumed Canadian gas would remain available indefinitely. Phase 2, expansion received final investment decision in November 2025, earlier than originally scheduled. Additional capacity, 14 million tons per year. When operational in 2028, combined capacity will redirect nearly 4 billion cubic feet daily toward Pacific markets. That's almost half the volume Canada currently exports to the United States, permanently removed from North American pipeline networks. The economic logic is brutal but simple. Asian LNG prices averaged $12–14 per $1 million BTU in 2025, North American Henry Hub prices averaged $320. Even accounting for liquefaction and shipping costs, Asian exports generate margins 50–70% higher than pipeline sales to American buyers. Canadian producers face straightforward choice: serve American utilities at 3–4 per million BTU, or serve Asian utilities at 10–12. Geography no longer determines destiny when shipping economics support distant markets. Why did Trump's Energy Department contact Canadian officials requesting supply increases in mid-January 2026? The surface explanation: American natural gas prices were rising faster than forecasts predicted. Henry Hub futures for March 2026 delivery hit $4.20 per million BTU, up 31% from December levels. That price acceleration threatened industrial competitiveness and raised heating costs for 47% of American households using natural gas. But the timing reveals deeper recognition. December 2025. U.S. natural gas storage falls to 2.1 trillion cubic feet, 18% below five-year average for that time of year. Below normal storage during peak heating season creates supply vulnerability if cold weather persists. January 8, 2026, Energy Information Administration releases short-term outlook projecting prices could reach $5 per million BTU if winter extends through March and Canadian imports don't recover. That would be highest winter price since 2014 natural gas supply crunch. January 10, 2026, first LNG cargo departs Kitimat. American energy analysts realize reduced pipeline volumes aren't temporary maintenance issues, they're permanent structural redirection toward export markets. January 12, 2026, Trump administration officials initiate contact with Canadian counterparts, not through formal diplomatic requests, through technical level conversations between energy departments framed as coordination discussions. The informal approach signals awareness that formal requests risk public rejection. January 14, 2026. Carney announces a $116 billion energy infrastructure program, including 2 additional LNG terminals, pipeline expansions serving Pacific Coast, and marine infrastructure improvements at British Columbia ports. The announcement timing 2 days after American requests sends unmistakable message. Canada's energy strategy prioritizes Asian markets regardless of American preferences. Notice what Trump's request didn't include. No threats of tariffs on Canadian energy as leverage for compliance. Trump learned that lesson after 2025. Tariffs accelerated rather than prevented Canadian diversification. No offers of premium pricing to compete with Asian buyers. American utilities operate under regulated rate structures, preventing them from paying global market prices even if they wanted to. No appeals to alliance obligations or shared security interests. Those arguments work when the requesting party treats the partner with respect. Trump spent 2 years threatening annexation and imposing punitive tariffs. Appeals to partnership ring hollow after that behavior. The request was effectively asking Canada to prioritize American buyers at below market prices because of geographic proximity and historical patterns. And Carney's infrastructure announcement was answer without needing to formally refuse. Canadian energy flows to whoever pays most and causes least political headaches. While Trump was requesting supply relief, Carney was finalizing contracts that guarantee American buyers lose priority access permanently. The $116 billion infrastructure program has components specifically designed to bypass American market entirely. Cedar LNG terminal, facility on British Columbia coast with capacity of 3 million tons annually when operational in 2027. The project partners include Pembina Pipeline and Haisla Nation, no American companies involved. Export contracts already signed with Japanese utilities under 15-year terms. Gas feeding that terminal comes from Western Canadian fields through pipelines that don't interconnect with southbound networks serving U.S. markets. KSI Leesim's LNG project, joint venture between Rockies LNG and Nisga'a Nation targeting 12 million tons annual capacity by 2029. Federal approval received November 2025 with environmental assessment, explicitly noting project reduces Canadian economic dependence on single export market. That phrasing doesn't appear accidentally in government documents. It signals policy intent. Coastal GasLink pipeline extensions, additional pipeline capacity from Montney and Horn River basins directly to Pacific terminals. These expansions serve export facilities exclusively. They don't connect to TransCanada pipelines feeding American markets. The infrastructure physically separates supply destined for Asia from supply available to United States. Marine infrastructure, Prince Rupert and Kitimat port expansions creating berthing capacity for 15 to 20 LNG carriers simultaneously. Ship-to-ship transfer capabilities allowing smaller vessels to shuttle gas to carriers too large for terminal docks. Navigation improvements enabling winter operations previously limited by weather. All investments serving export shipping rather than cross-border pipelines. Here's what this structure reveals. Canada isn't just selling some gas to Asia while maintaining American supply. Canada is building permanent infrastructure where Asian contracts receive priority and American buyers purchase residual volumes. Once those terminals operate at full capacity under long-term contracts, Canadian producers face contractual obligations to deliver. If production increases don't match export commitments plus domestic demand, the volume available for U.S. exports shrinks. American utilities that assumed Canadian supply would automatically scale with their needs are discovering that assumption no longer holds. Canadian officials are choosing language carefully when discussing energy export strategy. Natural Resources Minister Jonathan Wilkinson, January 15th statement, Canada's energy sector is positioned to serve growing global demand for cleaner LNG while supporting our climate objectives and economic prosperity. Notice the phrasing, global demand, not North American integration. Global signals Canada views energy as commodity for international markets, not regional partnership resource. Cleaner LNG references emissions reductions from electrified liquefaction facilities, but it also implies Canadian LNG competes on environmental credentials in markets where that matters, specifically Asian utilities under pressure to reduce emissions from coal while maintaining reliable baseload power. Mark Carney, infrastructure announcement, these nation-building projects position Canada as reliable energy supplier to growing economies across the Pacific Rim while creating tens of thousands of jobs here at home. Translation, Asian markets are priority because they're growing faster than mature North American demand, and serving them creates more economic value for Canada than maintaining historical supply patterns to the United States. Industry response reveals how completely priorities shifted. Canadian Natural Resources CEO earnings call January 2026. Our long-term production plans increasingly account for LNG export commitments. Pipeline capacity to U.S. markets remains important, but represents declining share of total export volumes. Declining share of total export volumes. That's corporate language for American buyers getting smaller piece of growing pie rather than priority access they used to receive. The most revealing absence. No Canadian official expressed concern about rising American prices or potential hardship for U.S. consumers. Statements focused entirely on Canadian economic benefits and Asian market opportunities. That's not callous indifference, it's recognition that Canadian energy policy no longer considers American preferences as primary concern. Norway faced similar dynamics when European dependence on Russian gas created market opportunity post-2022. Russia supplied 40% of European natural gas before invading Ukraine. When Russia cut deliveries, European prices spiked to record levels. Norway, as Europe's second largest gas supplier, could have dramatically increased production to ease crisis. Instead, Norway maintained production at sustainable levels and sold available volumes at peak market prices, generating windfall profits. European governments complained Norway should increase supply as matter of allied solidarity. Norwegian response, we're commercial producers selling at market prices to willing buyers. If you want priority access, sign long-term contracts at prices covering our costs and providing reasonable returns. Otherwise, we sell to highest bidder. European buyers had no leverage to force Norwegian production increases. No alternative suppliers could fill Russian volumes quickly. Europeans ultimately signed long-term contracts at Norway's terms because they had no choice. The lesson, suppliers with alternatives don't prioritize buyers based on geography or historical patterns. They serve customers offering best combination of price, contract terms, and reliable payments. Canada learned this watching Europe's crisis. When Trump spent 2024-2025 threatening tariffs and treating Canada as subordinate territory, Canadian energy planners realized dependence on American markets created vulnerability. If relationship deteriorated, Canadian producers needed alternative buyers. Asian LNG markets provided that alternative. The difference is Canada built the alternative before crisis forced the issue. By the time Trump's Energy Department requested supply increases. Infrastructure already existed to redirect gas elsewhere. Norway responded to European crisis reactively. Canada prepared proactively. This isn't about natural gas molecules. It's about whether economic integration between allies creates resilience or vulnerability. When the United States treats energy imports from closest ally as leverage for political demands, what message does that transmit? That reliable supply creates dependency supplier can exploit, that buyers should minimize imports from any single source regardless of geographic proximity, that economic integration is safe only between equals, not between dominant party and subordinate. When Canada builds infrastructure redirecting energy toward distant buyers rather than serving adjacent market, what does that signal? That geographic proximity matters less than relationship reliability. That infrastructure investments determine trade flows more than natural advantages, that middle powers can reduce great power leverage through strategic commerce decisions. For 70 years, North American energy trade operated on principles both accepted. Canadian producers would prioritize American markets because pipeline economics favored shortest routes to largest demand. American buyers would maintain steady demand supporting Canadian investment in production capacity. Temporary disruptions would be resolved through cooperation, recognizing mutual benefit. Integration made both countries more energy secure than either achieved independently. That model is dying, not because energy stopped crossing the border, because the assumption of automatic American priority collapsed. When Trump weaponized trade relationships and treated Canadian sovereignty as negotiable, Canada learned that serving American market carried political costs offsetting economic benefits. Asian buyers pay more and don't threaten annexation. The choice becomes obvious. The damage isn't reversible through policy adjustments or leadership changes. Once Canadian LNG terminals operate under 20-year contracts with Asian utilities, breaking those contracts would destroy Canada's reputation as reliable supplier. No producer sacrifices long-term market credibility for short-term accommodation of one buyer's preferences. Once Asian utilities build regasification capacity and pipeline networks designed around Canadian LNG supply, they won't abandon that infrastructure because American buyers want supply redirected. Infrastructure creates dependencies that persist decades. Once Canadian producers experience profit margins 50–70% higher from Asian sales compared to American pipeline deliveries, redirecting supply toward lower value markets requires either American buyers paying premium prices or government intervention, forcing producers to accept lower returns. Neither happens without political crisis. Once North American energy integration fractures, rebuilding it requires trust that Trump's behavior destroyed. Future Canadian governments inherit infrastructure and contracts prioritizing Asian markets. Reversing that strategic orientation means admitting diversification failed. Politicians don't voluntarily take that reputational hit. This creates permanent consequences. First, American natural gas prices rise structurally because supply that once flowed automatically south now competes in global markets where Asian buyers pay premiums. Second, Canadian energy sector becomes integrated with Asian economies through mutual dependencies that give Tokyo, Seoul, Beijing interest in Canadian energy security independent of Washington's preferences. Third, future American administrations negotiate Canadian energy imports as commercial transactions with supplier holding leverage, not as partnership where buyers' needs receive priority consideration. Fourth, other American energy partners, Mexico, Gulf states, potential Arctic producers, observe Canada successfully reducing U.S. dependence and question whether American market access justifies political constraints. Trump can request all he wants, but he destroyed the leverage that would make those requests effective. Trump could try imposing tariffs on Canadian LNG exports to punish diversification, but Canadian LNG goes to Asia by ship. Tariffs on seaborne exports are unenforceable unless U.S. Navy interdicts tankers in international waters. That's act of war, not trade policy. Could try offering American utilities subsidies to pay premium prices matching Asian buyers, but that costs federal treasury billions annually to maintain supply that used to flow at market prices. Fiscal conservatives would revolt. Every other commodity producer would demand equal subsidies. Could try pressuring Asian buyers to reject Canadian LNG through diplomatic channels, but Japan, South Korea, and China all need reliable gas supply more than they need to accommodate American preferences. Energy security trumps diplomatic courtesy, could try negotiating new partnership framework offering Canada guaranteed demand and stable pricing, but that requires admitting American leverage is gone and Canada holds stronger position. Trump doesn't negotiate as peer, he demands as superior. That approach fails when other party can walk away. The leverage evaporated. Trump's tariffs and threats pushed Canada to build alternatives. Now those alternatives are operational, more profitable, and secured by infrastructure investments that persist regardless of political relationships. No threat Trump can credibly make changes that structural reality. Trump wanted Canadian energy to remain automatically available whenever American buyers needed it at prices Washington considered reasonable. Instead, he triggered $116 billion in infrastructure, creating 40% reduction in Canadian pipeline exports to United States over 12 months, 3 major LNG terminals serving Asian markets under contracts extending to 2045, permanent capacity to redirect 5+ billion cubic feet daily toward Pacific rather than south rising American prices, while Canadian producers earn premium margins selling globally proof to every American ally that alternatives to U.S. dependence exist and prosper. Not through confrontation, not through alliance breakdown, through infrastructure construction that physically redirected energy flows while Washington was distracted, threatening rather than negotiating. Carney didn't reject Trump's request. He made the request irrelevant by proving Canadian gas has better buyers. The question now is what other allies are learning that lesson.